to Sandy and Nora's podcast.
What's up, Nora?
What? Hi.
I just thought I'd try something different. You didn't like it?
I liked it a lot. I was caught off guard.
Don't lie to me, Nora. Fine. Okay. Hey, Nora.
Oh yeah, sure. We'll do it again. Yeah. Hey, Sandy.
How's it going?
I'm great. I don't know if the listeners can hear this, but I'm on a new microphone. So I just had my birthday. And of course, because my life is so intertwined with my work, the big partner present was a microphone. So I'm on a new microphone and I mean, you can't hear it. You're just still hearing me through my phone. But
nope.
To you listeners, right. I hope that this penetrates your mind even deeper.
Well, that's great. I'm glad you got some good birthday gifts.
Yes.
Were you grateful for them? Look at me trying a very odd segue. Let's just do it. Let's thank the people.
Man, that's so fast. Okay, yeah. We will thank the people and then I will ask how you're doing.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah, thanks this week to everybody who shared the podcast. I'm seeing a lot of folks sharing the Daily News podcast, specifically saying that it's your favorite daily news podcast. Thank you so much. And remember, in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to start to split this feed, the Sandy and Nora feed, from the Daily News feed. It will help us advertise the two shows better because they're just such different shows that it'll be great. So you'll have to find the Daily News feed to resubscribe. We'll remind you about a million times. So thank you to everyone who's loving that. And thanks especially this week to Sarah and Laura for your support.
Thank you so much. And Nora, so guess what I discovered last week?
Mid-June. Did you discover that Biden's still alive? Because I'm waiting for that confirmation myself.
I mean, you really got to confirm that every day. So I can't say that I confirmed that today again. But oh man, not looking good for the oldies in the United States, huh?
Nope. Geriocracy, not efficient.
No, not at all. No, that's not it. What I've discovered is I was having a little bit of issues with the Patreon. So I went in and Nora, we've got fans messaging us on Patreon that it looks like we're dicks because we're ignoring them, but we haven't gone in there. And there's all of these lovely messages, sometimes questions, and y'all, we're sorry. Most people are contacting us in another way. So, and we've never really looked at the Patreon message feed, but it's there, and there's lots of messages for us. So we're gonna try to go through those, I guess, in the next little bit. And thanks for reaching out to us on Patreon if that's what you've been doing. And sorry we've been so silent.
Yeah, sorry about that. I also have to say, I had kind of a negative interaction with a fan, and it kind of made me think a little bit about the relationship that we build on this podcast and with you, the folks listening to us. And, if we ever say something that you disagree with and you tell us that you disagree with it, don't get surprised when I'm like, no, but I stand by what I said. That wasn't a mistake. Because that'll avoid perhaps disappointment in the responses. Certainly let us know if you disagree with something. And when I can, I respond. I mean, there are a lot of messages, as Sandy says, so sometimes it's just not possible to respond to everybody. But if it's the case that you're like, hey, what you said was wrong or bad, or I disagree with it, and I'm like, oh, okay, this was why I said that, but I think I'm right. Don't be surprised because I'm not so careless with what I say. I know what I'm saying. So yeah, shout out to that listener. I don't know if they're going to keep listening, but the messages got really, really angry really quickly. So, and you'll notice if you do listen still, I'm not responding because I don't think there's any point. And that's okay because we are allowed to sometimes just not engage.
Yeah. And, to disagree. Disagreement is actually really great because it helps us to defend our positions and to understand where our principles lie. Yeah. So not a bad thing.
Super good thing.
So Nora, what's going on in the world today?
Well, there's a heat wave that's hitting the central to eastern part of Canada. Actually, I should just say eastern part of Canada because let's not pretend that Southern Ontario is central. we all know that that's Winnipeg. And and shout out to the folks I saw in Winnipeg last week. My God, I love that city, and it was just so nice to have a couple of hours there to hang out. But heat wave brain seems to be infecting a lot of people. It's should be real heavy as of tomorrow, as when you're listening to this. So as of right now, you should be living in the middle of a heat wave. If you're in Toronto all the way to Cape Spear, I think it's really covering that much of the country. And so otherwise, that's my way of saying, Sandy, that I'm not paying attention to the weather, because all I can think of is playing soccer inside of a stadium on Wednesday night, and whether or not that's going to be my last moment on Earth.
Oh my God. That's really dark.
Sorry. I've been trying to take it easy.
I guess that's the world we're living in. Okay, yeah, there's that. And what we're going to talk about tonight is actually some foreign interference news. Nora, did it ever feel to you like, when we went to school in the 90s, mostly, we would learn about like the Cold War as something that was back then and then had ended. And then you're like 40 now and you're just like, did it end? I don't know if those classroom lessons were correct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So foreign interference, and the interference is not just in the way that impacts Canada, which of course is, what we're probably most concerned with as being in Canada, but the poles of power are changing, as we've said many times on the show, and it's like pretty wild to see revelations of foreign interference circulate online, especially as it relates to the pandemic, because as we all will remember, the earliest days of the pandemic were a very specific kind of shock. The mid days of the pandemic were a different kind of shock. There were still shocking things happening, but there was experience that we're living through this. And with experience of living through the pandemic also came experience of how to manipulate people in the pandemic. And that's what I really loved about the earliest days of the pandemic, was very clear that the normal processes of spinning things or of misinformation or of confusing people wasn't exactly possible, because our leaders were just as confused by what was happening as we were. And so, there was certainly some ways that the narrative was mishandled, or things like the whole question about whether or not masks needed to be worn. And we'll all remember that kind of dance at the beginning of the pandemic. But as it continued on, the sophistication of international capitalism, frankly, was able to actually manipulate the ways that we were understanding the pandemic in a really fundamental way. And Sandy, this past week, we found out that one of those manipulations, which Canadians may not have seen a lot of, some Canadians probably did see it a lot, was happening by the CIA in the United States.
Yeah, that bombshell report came out in Routers this week, and I was stunned as I read it. It talked about the U.S., the Pentagon, using accounts that were on Twitter and other social media that were as old as, in some cases, 5 years, active accounts that had been active for 5 years, that they then used to try to sow disinformation, specifically to create an anti-vax campaign in the Philippines directed towards Chinese-made vaccines. And of course, when you're creating a campaign like that, it's, first of all, it's online, so you can't really contain it. And secondly, you can try to make it focused on the Chinese vaccines, but it is contributing to a global, worldwide feelings about vaccines. And also, what the fuck? Over 40,000 people died in the Philippines. And there was a considerable, whether it was this campaign or the global sentiments around vaccines, it was certainly successful in that there was a large movement of folks who are anti-vax and perhaps still is in the Philippines and, of course, beyond. Now, the campaign apparently started in the Philippines and then expanded to other parts of Asia. And again, I don't know how they target this. And when Reuters asked Twitter, for example, about this, they deleted a bunch of these accounts. But it really makes me wonder, like, if this is a campaign that the Pentagon has run successfully during such a fraught time for people worldwide. What other campaigns have been run to try to destabilize support in states that the United States considers rivals? Like, what else have we seen? The Reuters article goes on to say that the government, the Pentagon, has been using social media since in and around 2010, and it's like, what for? Like, what else? And what would we know about it? When can we know about it? And what's being hidden from us?
Yeah. It's so fascinating because, one of the side effects of globalization, obviously, is that we're extremely networked, regardless of where we are in the world. And the impact of doing that in the Philippines is not isolated to the Philippines, especially considering how much back and forth there is between people that go from the Philippines to other countries, Canada, of course, included. And it was actually interesting for me to see this specifically in the Philippines because I relied on Filipino news sources from the Philippines, but with a Canadian focus, to see what was going on among Filipino citizens in Canada who were doing care work that put them at greater risk of infection and death for COVID. And so I was actually reading quite a lot from that community, obviously having no idea that there was this anti-vax movement within like the Philippines sowed by the United States against Sinovac. The other kind of interesting thing that happened as I was reading this article in my mind was I was like, I always had it like just kind of tucked away, the kind of efficacy that we were all told about Sinovac compared to Pfizer and Moderna. And to this day, if I was like doing COVID trivia and someone asked me about the efficacy of Sinovac compared to the other two, I would instantly say that it was effective. It was probably 60% effective or so. So, way better than like flu vaccinations, but not as good as the Pfizer or the Moderna shots. And as you were talking, I looked it up, and actually at 3 doses, there's almost no difference between the efficacy between Sinovac and Pfizer. In fact, there is a slight advantage. I mean, slight being 97 to 98 or 96 to 97 or so among the 70 to 79 age group for Pfizer vaccinated people. And then there's this more significant, still not that significant, still in the high 90s, but a bigger gap between Pfizer and Sinovac being ahead in the 80 plus category. And then the younger age groups, it seems pretty much neck and neck. If they're not exactly the same, then they are just a little bit off. And, so you asked the question, what kind of other rumors or innuendo or campaigns were there around these vaccines? Or anything else, frankly, like we have no idea. But if we get a glimpse into what the United States was doing in Philippines, knowing very well just how much the narrative was juiced on vaccinations in general in Canada, I mean, yeah, that's the $1 million question is what other campaigns were foreign powers like the United States encouraging or running or funding? And how did Canada buy into that? I know international students that came to Canada that had only been vaccinated with Sinovac, and the Canadian government forced them to be vaccinated with a Pfizer or Moderna vaccine because that's the only ones we recognized. And so there was also just like those kinds of policies to just, signal to Canadians, number one, but then also to the world that this is an inferior vaccine, while the Chinese vaccine went way further around the world to reach more people than the Western-made vaccines, which were then used to massively enrich both Moderna and Pfizer. And we hoarded those in the Western nations away from countries that desperately needed those first vaccines.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels very, very unconscionable. And this isn't just to say, this isn't just to focus on the United States. Like, let's also, be aware that there's been these sorts of campaigns that we know from Russia as well. And it's just like when you are interacting on the internet, I mean, gosh, it's like one of the reasons why I just can't interact on Twitter anymore is because there's so much within Black Twitter that feels fake to me, that doesn't feel like it's real. And I'm looking at all of these accounts that don't seem to be real from metrics that we would use to determine like whether, like how long ago they've been started up, like how many people follow them, whether their tweets are consistent. And like, it makes me wonder, like, what is useful to people who are trying to destabilize populations? Like, what are the conversations that they want to get in there and be a part of? And it's just another level of media literacy that we need as people who are interacting online that goes beyond like your typical bot stuff, because the government is using this stuff too. And as the world kind of reshapes itself into this new Cold War space, it's going to be important for us to keep our eyes on what's happening. And of course, we have foreign interference in the news here in Canada with an intelligence report that's been talked about in the last couple of weeks, revealing that that some Canadian MPs, members of Parliament, have been, some of the reports suggest that there are some MPs who have been working with or colluding, and some MPs who have been like, maybe it's wittingly or unwittingly, if to use the CBC news text, supporting or helping agents overseas who are trying to interfere in our politics. And so this has been in the news for a little bit, not just this particular case of this intelligence report, but also over the last couple of years, there's been a few stories in Canada, mostly again focused on Chinese interference and how MPs and MPPs, if you're watching Ontario News, have been involved in supporting some sort of foreign interference in our elections.
Yes. So this report that came out last week, it's actually kind of like unbelievable that we have this situation where there's a report that talks about foreign interference. The report has not been made public. And that's number one. Why? Why in the hell would a report like this not be made public? Why would the population or journalists not have the right to scrutinize it? And Elizabeth May comes out last week and she says that she's satisfied with the report. It implicates or perhaps incriminates a former MP, but otherwise she thinks that the report is a good report to show how Canada is managing foreign interference. Then a couple of days later, Jagmeet Singh comes out and as if he's reading the report, but through the mirror, he says that he's extremely concerned about the content of the report, and that there are people named in the report who are still MPs, and that he would classify them or characterize them as being traitors from what he read. And it's like, who are we to believe here? And how are we supposed to understand this? I mean, there's no question that there's foreign interference. We see foreign interference all the time. And as you say, experiencing these accounts on Black Twitter that don't feel real or authentic, or there's something weird about them. I certainly have also, I always pay attention to when I'm interacting with accounts that just don't seem real. Now, once you check off of the really obvious ways that accounts aren't real, like a weird name or a name and a bunch of numbers or a brand new account and this kind of thing, it gets a lot more disorienting when it's an account that's been around for 5 or 6 years and it seems like it's normal. I have experience dealing with people whose those accounts are not who they say they are. And I've seen people who let their Twitter account go only to be resurrected as a zombie account that does these kinds of attacks. And so, this is something that very much happens all the time. But when it comes to the way that the federal government is trying to investigate foreign interference and the lack of information that they're telling us, what is the game being played here by Elizabeth May? And then what is the game being played here by Jagmeet Singh? And then what is the game being played here by the Liberals and the machine that has made the decision to not render these documents public? It just seems that like every step of this story is made to be boring and opaque and difficult to follow so that most Canadians will check out and not actually care too much either way about what the report may or may not say.
Yeah, I mean, like every time I see a story on this, on a report on this story, it's like it kind of infuriates me and reminds me of just how little we have access to as Canadians about like what is going on in certain levels of our government and certain sectors of our public service. It's like, okay, so there's this report. You're like, great, I want to read about it. Oh, you can't. Okay. It's like super redacted. Cool. But we're not even going to release it to you. Okay. And it says that maybe some MPs are helping China and India. It focuses on in foreign interference. Then Elizabeth May comes out and says, no, I'm relieved. It's totally like I read it. Don't worry, Canadians. As the reader, I am relieved. We should be cool. Jagmeet comes out and says, I too have read it. I am very concerned. You're just like, what is this story about? Can somebody help me? Like, what's going on? Can we have a little bit more context? Something. And I mean, the latest is that Elizabeth May is saying that they need to have a conversation about it, but in private. Like, what? Are we allowed to know what's happening? Like if there is some sort of interference in our political system and you have discovered this, should the electorate not know about it so that, you know, we can respond to that in some way or change the way that we feel about things, or at least do a little bit more research? No, that part's not important. The impact of it is not important. It's just like, it feels like, Elizabeth May and Jagmeet Singh are in fact playing a political game, because it seems like it is more about who those MPs are and like how that might help or hurt or whatever an election, like an actual political election, versus how it has actually impacted people who are part of the electorate. Like I feel like most of the articles are not discussing that. I mean, I obviously haven't read them all, but most of them are not discussing that. And it's like, well, what is this story about? It's like lots of words to say we don't know anything in most of these stories. And it's really, really quite frustrating.
It's actually, it's frustrating, but it's also a real fascinating look at how journalism can be completely unhelpful. We know that there's foreign interference in Canada. We know that there was a political assassination in Canada that was likely ordered by someone involved in the Indian government. We know that. This has been rendered public to us. We obviously, as Canadians, I think, expect that there's some level of interference by the Americans, and that level of interference is literally like, hey, Mr. Trudeau, you will do this. And then Justin's like, you betcha. And it was the exact same thing with Harper and with Martin and Chrétien and Mulroney. I mean, that's just how politics works in Canada. And so, you know, to have May and Singh play this game is confusing in and of itself. The journalism on this issue is not great. And then there's another kind of piece of it that definitely is worth a mention. CBC reports that the Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet wants to be able to read the report as well, and he's got to go through the process of getting the proper security clearance. Now, that's just thrown out in this article as if it's like a given, which I think is really weird. Like, sorry, he's a political party leader, and so are Singh and May. And I don't assume that Singh and May have read the document because they've passed like whatever the fucking government version of Nexus is or whatever. And so, you know, this article by Catherine Tunney just drops it in there like, oh yeah, Blanchet's going to get the security clearance or try to get the security clearance. And then, oh, what's the real story here? The real story is that Pierre Poilievre is refusing to even try to get this security clearance. And that has been used by liberals, both by government liberals, like people in power, people who are elected, but then also just liberal hacks or partisans or whatever, fans, to demonstrate that Poilievre is not a serious candidate for prime minister. And it seems to me that that's the Liberals' way of spinning this, is that let's not talk about what's in this report. I can't imagine that the report only implicates Liberal MPs if it implicates anybody. But if it's implicating anybody, it's likely implicating both Liberal and Conservative MPs because they're both the closest to power. I imagine that May and Singh have come out in the ways that they have because it does not implicate the Green Party or the NDP. And here we are with the channel turned on, but Poilievre can't get security clearance. Now, I've seen a lot of people whining about this whole security clearance thing. And it's like, again, what is that? What kind of security? Like, do we live in a country where the leaders of parties have to pass through security clearance to get access to certain pieces of information? Like, don't they get that by nature and virtue of just being elected? And then aren't they then held to certain standards of codes of conduct and parliamentary procedure and ethics? Like, what is with this layer of the security state then also now wagging the leadership of the parties? I don't know. Maybe I'm reading this a bit too conspiratorial, but it just seems to me like the perfect storm of stuff to make average people go, this is a whole bunch of bullshit and I am not paying attention.
Well, yeah, it's just like it like, you know, that the Pierre Poilievre angle to it too. It just like feels like jockeying for a particular political class of people who are paying attention, using like a certain lens, who are, as we know, already decided on how they're going to vote. So I don't really know why one would do it that way, but I don't know, Nora. It's just like one of those additional signs that we like live in a really fake country. Like, I almost feel like Canada like kind of operates like exactly like a corporation that would have like a secret wing that maybe the board doesn't know a little bit about what's going on over there with their marketing wing or whatever the fuck. Like, it just seems very, very strange that this news, I mean, yeah, like when it came out, it was like a bombshell report, but the discussion about that like bombshellness was like, oh, what's in it? You know, like who's done it? Like, what is this about? Rather than like how does that impact us on the ground? Like, what is it that we are being made to believe? Like, can we not? I don't think that that's conspiratorial. When you're asking those questions about security clearance, I think it's like a basic question about, is this really a democracy? Like, what is it if we don't have access at the highest levels to what it is that this government, that this country is involved in and what it's doing? Like, this is a report about their peers and the actions of their peers that they sit with in the House all the time to have arguments that are supposed to be in the best interests of Canadians, whatever that means. Like, what the fuck? Like, why wouldn't they have access to this beyond going into a secret room that's apparently a Faraday room? If the CBC report is to be believed, it just says that it's a room where they're not allowed to bring cell phones or electronics, and they have to like read the document all alone, and then they can't discuss it. It just seems so strange. It's like, what if we're talking about elected members of the House, should we not have that information? Like, for fuck's sake, like. It is really frustrating to consistently like compare what folks in the United States, the United Kingdom, and other countries are able to get access to and what we can't have access to in Canada.
Oh, no, totally. And again, as you say, like it just shows how patently fake this whole operation is. Because if we lived in a real country, the people who are the leadership of the parties would not have to submit to CSIS. It'd be the other way around, right? Like, I hate this issue so much because it's like it's as if there's people in Canada that are like, okay, how do we make the Russian interference issue in the United States come to Canada and be the silver bullet that keeps the Liberals in power? And then this all happens and the Liberals are like, oh shit, this is not what we had hoped for. This is not going to be helpful. What do we do now? And it's like, there is no sunlight between the foreign policy of the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party on the issues, like the biggest issues of the day. There's some sunlight on whether or not you fund abortions for people in other countries. But when it comes to the biggest questions of our alliances, what we think about China, what we think about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the two parties are pretty much hand in glove. And so foreign interference does not become a useful frame for any party to try and beat over the head of the other party because they're so both involved. And the fact that we're not being told, like, it's just so nuts. I'm frustrated that Singh would come out and say that there were traitors without then saying what the hell he's talking about, because the only thing that does is then it has Melanie Joly responding to say there are no traitors in the Liberal caucus. And then it's like, is she lying? Is he lying? She has more to lose, so maybe Joly is lying, but Singh might be trying to, I don't know, make himself more important, so maybe he's lying. Maybe the two of them are trying to operate all of this because the only people named are Conservative members. But at the end of the day, the only foreign interference that matters is the United States. It's the United States. Every single thing that happens in this country does not happen without the green light from Washington. And the fact that is not how this story is told is so unbelievably pathetic. Like, if there's anything that we can learn with how Canada has been navigating Israel's genocide, it's that they will not do anything. They will not take any action. They will not make any statement unless another country has done it first and the United States is right behind, or maybe a different order in that kind of chain of reactions. And it's like, guys, like, the American empire is crumbling. What does foreign interference look like in a country that is so deeply wrapped up with the United States? And there are personal connections on either side of the border, and there's personal connections with high-ranking officials. I mean, my God, if you looked at the list of Brian Mulrooney's buddies down in his Palm Springs or Palm, Florida, what is it, Palm Springs or Palm Beach mansion, like his buddies were all the ruling class of the United States. Like, it is so, the influence is so intense when it comes to the United States that it's not even worth talking about. And so, like, having no real idea about the purpose of the influence, it's like, what are we sussing out here? Like, if India is doing things in Canada to try and quell an independence movement in India, that's one kind of logic. That's a thing that we can understand because it makes a kind of sense. We can say that it's bad logic, but we can understand it. Like, what exactly does China need to do to interfere in Canada? Like, there's no way on fucking earth that there's anybody in the Chinese government that's like, we will take the riding of Don Valley West. Like, they don't need to do that because they can buy their way into the Canadian market as they do. And so again, it's just like every person telling this story is as if they're like, okay, first I need you to believe in the Tooth Fairy. And now we're going to talk about the life and times of the Tooth Fairy. And no one is standing up and going, the Tooth Fairy doesn't fucking exist. Ooh, I should have put a content warning on that. Sorry if you're listening and you're under the age of 5, because we do know that there are kids that listen to this. Parents, you're gonna have to deal with that on yourselves. I'm super sorry. No one's saying the obvious thing. And this is like this is the issue, to see journalism flourish and get it right and politicians rise to the occasion. I mean, it's just like, it's so pathetic. It's just like watching the Titanic go down and they're like, oh my God, it's getting so wet.
Yeah, it also points to like how the political representatives in Canada, like they all seem to like coalesce towards being the same like version of like one kind of entity. Like nobody is willing to jump out of that really tiny box that is like, here is how you can be a respectable politician in Canada. Like, and the only people who are willing to jump out of that are, what's his name who assaulted you at that conference, Maxime Bernier, and like in some cases Pierre Poilievre. But I mean, maybe Pierre Poilievre can be seen to be the guy who's kind of stepped out of this small container of what's acceptable for Canadian politicians to do and say, definitely Maxime Bernier. But I mean, by and large, there's just like this tiny little box that they are not really, I mean, there's this convention that, they can't do much out of it, which makes them all kind of coalesce into being the same thing. I mean, like, where is the political courage? And I mean, courage is a very strong word to be used here. This is seems like really basic stuff. But where is the political courage to tell us what's going on if it is truly, as you say, right? Like, if you're Elizabeth May and you're looking at this report and saying, hey, there's nothing here, then tell us what the nothing there is. If it's nothing, then presumably it wouldn't be an issue for you to tell us what that is. And similarly for Jagmeet Singh, if it's to the level of being treason, perhaps you should tell us about that, because that means that there are people who are being elected into the parliament who, I don't know, perhaps could be elected again unless we know something about this. If it is that level of concerning, then should we not know how that is impacting us, what it's impacting us on, and at least have a little bit more information so that we can make a decision about whether or not to elect those people again? Because, my God, if the stakes that we know of when there is foreign interference, which is, up to from elections up to assassination to sowing discord and concern and skepticism on science that is meant to save people during a pandemic to the tune of tens of thousands of people dying, perhaps even more. We may never know what the extent of the U.S. The extent of what the impact was of the U.S. Anti-vax campaign. Like, if those are the stakes, then we should know. We should be able to know, as people who are apparently living in a democracy and voting in these very people who are engaged in this stuff.
Well, and especially now, as we know that there's also targeted campaigns that are originating inside of Israel that are trying to whip up support for what Israel's doing and denigrate and cast aside critics of Israel. And we know that they've targeted North American activists. And I mean, my God, like Sandy, you've asked about my Twitter feed. I think we're pretty clearly able to say that's exactly what's happening in my Twitter feed when I talk about Israel's genocide on Gaza, and I am inundated by responses. Those people are not real. They're not people that follow me. They don't know that I exist. They're probably not human. We know foreign interference, the way that it operated in the Philippines around the anti-vax stuff, like the social media coordinated foreign interference, happens in Canada all the time. And I've never, ever, ever, ever seen a single institution give a fuck about that. And I go back to what happened to me after the Humboldt Broncos bus crash, where I saw that from the inside. And I remember I did very, very, very few interviews after that because I didn't want the issue to be me, frankly. But I did one interview with CBC. And I remember right after the show, the panelist, we were talking on the street, and he said, "So have you handed over the logs of your account to any journalists or professors or anybody that can see the patterns of what it looked like, this intense attack on you?" And remember, like, fucking Sarah Palin got involved, right? So it went international. And I said to him, I was the most confounded that no one ever followed up with me to see if they could look at the patterns of my account, to look at the patterns of the replies, to look at the patterns of the messages, to see if we could pull out IP addresses, to see if we could figure out if this stuff was coming from Canada or coming from outside of Canada. If it was coming from Canada, where was it coming from inside of Canada? And what does a social media swarm or a wave actually look like if we want to deconstruct it? Nothing. I didn't do a single interview after that. I didn't do a single anything. No one was interested in this, which always struck me as very, very strange, because that kind of interference is super normal. And we're seeing the life and death stakes of that kind of interference when we're talking about the way that Palestinian activists and activism is being turned into, name whatever kind of insulting thing that you want to call it, anything from terrorism to anti-Semitism. Now, going back to this report, I think like this is a really telling part of a CBC article. This one's from Raisi Rafiq that just shows exactly how the Liberals are handing the Conservatives a gift here. And Rafiq doesn't actually explain to me what's true in this. We just have a back and forth. And so here it is. We have Pierre Poilievre saying that he wants the Liberal government to release the names of the MPs who have been accused of either wittingly or semi-wittingly cooperating or collaborating with a foreign state. And Poilievre says this, quote, Canadians have a right to know who and what is the information, unquote. He said this in question period. In response, again, and all of this is on Rosemary Barton's show, so I also am very, very cynical about CBC playing this up just so that people watch Rosemary Barton, because otherwise no one would, because she's so boring. But on Rosemary Barton's show, as a lot of these fucking sentences start at the CBC, Dominic LeBlanc says this, quote, we are not able by law to announce a series of names. It is completely irresponsible and it's illegal, unquote. What?
Like,
it's what? And then, of course, the article ends. Rafiq doesn't tell us if it's actually illegal or why it's illegal or what exact law would be contravening. Like, what are you talking? What? Why is that illegal?
Yeah, give me more. Why is it illegal to know that? It's like, what is this story about? Is it illegal to help a foreign interference? Is this totally regular? If this is totally regular shit, then just leave me alone. If it's not totally regular shit, then tell me something real. Like, don't tell me that this is just randomly illegal and irresponsible. That just sounds like some bullshit that you made up. Like, give me something real. Finish the article. Oh my God.
Yeah. And let us know, because as you say, this does sound like it's bullshit. It does sound like it's made up. Like, illegal is good enough. You don't have to say it's irresponsible if it's illegal. If it's illegal. And is it illegal because the committee has terms and references that make it illegal, or is it illegal because it's objectively something that cannot be named by law? And then why? If a member of parliament has been found to reasonably be helping a foreign country, I think it's probably in Canadians' interest to say that. And I think that Pierre Poilievre, who has this refusal to get whatever this security clearance is to read the report, he gets to play the average person in this story who will not see the report on principle or whatever the fuck is stopping him from getting this clearance. I don't know. And then can say, exactly, as an average Canadian, I want to know. I want to know. Even though his member, like, they probably are implicated in this. It's because he knows the game, and he knows that at the end of the day, when you call for something to be transparent, Canadians support that. And the Liberals are just handing him another present.
I mean, I think some of the quotes in this article, too, the very same one that you were referring to, are kind of hilarious and deserve to be read. So, you know, Poilievre is saying what he's saying. And one of the responses from Jagmeet Singh says that he's criticizing the Trudeau government for not doing enough to curb the interference. And the quote says, he's effectively implicitly saying a certain amount of foreign interference I can live with. But like, aren't you too? Because, I mean, you're just like, yeah, this is traitorous, but you're not telling us anything more. You're not telling us what the stakes are. You're not telling us anything. Like, what are you supposing should be done? And in terms of like Poilievre not looking at it, it's like, oh, he has a responsibility to look at it. Like, who does he? Who cares? None of the rest of us apparently do. And we're the ones who are doing the election thing. So anyway, y'all get it. We're upset. Canada's a fake country, and we do whatever the U.S. says anyway. So foreign interference be damned, right?